Believe it or not, carbs are testosterone friendly. So you don't want to be on a low carb diet because it's going to tank your testosterone. Obviously, these are serum testosterone levels, again, nanograms per deciliter, um, nearly 4 times higher on a high carb diet. And what that's defined as is 70% carbs, 10% protein versus 44% protein, 35% carbs in terms of energy, calories from that source. High carb, take home winner right here with testosterone levels. So I'm not saying you need to go on a high carb diet. I'm just showing you the impact of carbohydrates on testosterone. And it's very clear that low carb would correlate with lower testosterone. Again, I think we talked about this earlier. Serum testosterone, protein carb ratio. The lower the protein carb ratio, meaning the more carbs versus protein, the better testosterone profile. Athletes know the importance of carbs for performance. You should at this point too. We are pro carb. Obviously, quality sources, but it's obvious why. Because carbs modulate one of the most powerful measurements of hormonal exercise performance, the free testosterone to cortisol ratio. Again, cortisol is essentially bad for testosterone. It's not bad in general, but bad for testosterone, and testosterone is good for you. So you want a high testosterone to cortisol ratio. So carbs are obviously beneficial for that. Just driving this point home, low carb, if you're on a low carb diet and you got away with it till this point and you lost some weight, cool, good for you. It's not the way you want to go for the rest of your life because it's A, not sustainable, B, it's just flat out wrong for your hormone profile, and C, life is better with carbs. Just make sure you're eating the right ones. Again, let's look at the influence of dietary carbohydrate intake on the free testosterone to cortisol ratio in response to short-term intensive exercise training. Okay, higher carb is blue, lower carb is red. What happens after day 3 of training and you're on a low carb diet? Testosterone crashes. What happens after day 3 of training and you're on a regularly high carb diet? Testosterone spikes. Driving this point home. Same thing with serum cortisol levels. So we want cortisol low, right? So blue, higher carbs, red, lower carbs. Cortisol dramatically higher than on a higher carb diet. A higher carb diet keeps cortisol low the entire time. So since cortisol has a suppressive effect on testosterone, you want cortisol to stay low. Therefore, carbs are good for testosterone. Okay, so what I want you guys to take away from this, if you go way back to the hypothalamus pituitary gonadal axis in men, the GnRH is released by the hypothalamus. GnRH acts upon the pituitary gland. The pituitary then releases follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone that acts upon the testes. The testes then produce testosterone. Okay, so all I'm telling you here, and I'm just showing you the evidence, I'm not telling you what to do, carb intake and testosterone levels. Carbs are obviously one of the most important macronutrients for hormonal health. Here's what happens. Here's why. The neurons in the brain, the neurons in the hypothalamus that are responsible for releasing GnRH, which acts upon the pituitary, which then acts upon the testes, which then creates testosterone, they literally respond to the levels of glucose in the blood. The more GnRH or the more glucose in the blood from carbohydrates, the more GnRH will be released, which will directly impact your testosterone levels. So it actually starts in the brain. That's why carbs are important. The brain uses anywhere between 20 and 25% of glucose in the body at any given point to operate and function properly. And this is one of the reasons why, because it actually modulates its hormone output based on glucose levels in the blood. Isn't that incredible? The brain can detect glucose levels in the blood and will therefore adjust or regulate its hormone production accordingly. So if your glucose is really low because of a low carb diet, it's going to consequentially tell the brain to release less gonadotropin releasing hormone, which will tell the pituitary gland to release less FSH and LH, which will tell the gonads to release less testosterone. So if you want higher levels of testosterone, you should intake your carbs accordingly. Okay, let's talk about carbs. Again, what do you want to have? 30 to 60% of your daily calories from carbs. It's roughly, for most guys, ballpark, 150 to 300 grams of carbs a day. Nutrient-dense sources, okay? Nutrient-dense. Not candy, not super sugary stuff. These are the things that will support testosterone production, prevents muscular breakdown and fatigue, and it balances your blood sugar. So 50 to 100 grams a meal, minimum. minimally processed carbs, and prioritize testosterone boosting sources. So ideally, you do want to have carbs with nearly every meal throughout the day if possible. The perfect day is a good ratio of fats, carbs, and proteins for every meal. But this is how you want to do this. All right. So let's talk about the staples: quinoa, wild rice, potatoes, fruit, raw honey, sourdough. Staples every day if you want. No problem with that. Occasionally, steel cut oats, brown rice, pure maple syrup, pasta, beans, lentils, legumes, tortillas. Okay, you can have these. You can have these a couple times a week, but just try to avoid them every day. Minimize white rice, processed bread, some of the higher processed, the higher glycemic index carbs, the ones that will spike your blood sugar. So if we're going to explain why absolute staples versus occasionally versus minimize, it's typically going to have to do with the glycemic index, and the lower the glycemic index, the better for